If someone handed you a letter with your name on it, and you recognized the handwriting immediately, would you open it? Even if the person who wrote it had vanished 32 years ago. I didn't. Not at first. Because the moment I saw that handwriting, I knew one thing. Some secrets don't stay buried because they're forgotten. They stay buried because someone is making sure they're never found. My name is Margaret Ellis. I'm 68 years old. For 40 years, I taught English at Hawthorne High School. Every September, I gave my students the same advice. The answers you're looking for are usually hiding in plain sight. I never imagined those words would one day come back to haunt me. Most people think retirement is peaceful. Mine wasn't. Every Tuesday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, I walked the 3 blocks from my house to the old Carnegie Library. The building had stood there longer than anyone could remember. Stone columns, tall stained glass windows, shelves that seemed to stretch forever. It smelled of old paper, polished wood, and memories. Some people visited churches when they needed comfort. I visited the library. The librarians knew me by name. The regular readers nodded as I walked past. Nothing ever changed. Until one rainy Tuesday, I carried an old hardcover novel to the front desk. Its spine had split after years of use. Thomas Reed, the head librarian, smiled as he accepted it. "I'm afraid this one has reached retirement before you have." I laughed. It lasted longer than most people expected. He turned the book over in his hands. "I'll send it downstairs for restoration." I nodded and started toward the exit. Then he called after me, "Margaret." I turned around. "You've borrowed this same title every autumn for nearly 35 years. I smiled. Some stories deserve to be read more than once. I left without another word. I had no idea those would be the last ordinary minutes of my life. The next afternoon my telephone rang. Thomas sounded unsettled. "Margaret, could you come to the library? Is something wrong? I'd rather show you." There was something in his voice. Not fear. Confusion. 30 minutes later, I walked into the library's restoration room. Most visitors never knew it existed. Shelves filled with damaged books lined the walls. Tiny brushes, cotton gloves, delicate tools. The kind of place where forgotten things were carefully brought back to life. A young conservator stood beside the workbench. She looked at me, then at Thomas. Without saying a word, Thomas picked up the novel I had returned. Its cover had been carefully removed. The cracked spine lay open. Inside the hollow binding, there had been enough space to hide something no thicker than a postcard. Thomas reached into a protective folder. Then he carefully placed an old cream-colored envelope on the table. Every sound in the room disappeared. My eyes never left the envelope. Across the front, written in dark blue ink that had faded with age, were 2 words: Margaret Ellis. My knees almost gave way. I knew that handwriting. I hadn't seen it in 32 years. Thomas spoke quietly. "We found it sealed inside the spine. I don't think anyone has touched it since the book was bound." I couldn't answer, because there was only one person who ever wrote my name like that. Samuel Brooks. The man who disappeared without a trace. The man the town eventually stopped talking about. The man I had spent 32 years trying to forget. My fingers trembled as I picked up the envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. The seal had never been broken. Thomas frowned. "Do you know who wrote it?" For a long moment I couldn't speak. Then I whispered one word. "Yes." Neither of us moved. The room felt smaller, heavier, as though the library itself was waiting. I turned the envelope over. On the back, beneath the old wax seal, someone had written one final sentence. "If you're reading this, someone finally made a mistake." I stared at those words, over and over, 'cause they didn't sound like a goodbye. They sounded like a warning. And suddenly, I wasn't wondering what was inside the letter. I was wondering who had spent 32 years making sure I would never read it. With trembling hands, I finally broke the wax seal. Inside the envelope, there wasn't a confession. There wasn't a love letter. There was only a small library checkout card. And on the back, 7 handwritten words that made my heart stop. Start with shelf D19. Trust no one. I looked at the checkout card for a long time. It wasn't the kind libraries use today. It was old, thick cream-colored paper. The edges were worn smooth. Years of fingerprints had polished the surface. Across the front was the title of the novel I had returned. Nothing unusual. It was the back that changed everything. In Samuel's handwriting, only 7 words. Start with shelf D19. Trust no one. Thomas studied my face. What does it mean? I don't know. That wasn't entirely true. I knew exactly where shelf D19 was. It had been my favorite aisle since I was 16. History. Local history. Every research project I ever assigned my students began there. I hadn't walked down that aisle in years. Not since Samuel disappeared. Thomas looked toward the main reading room. The library closes in 40 minutes. I slipped the card into my coat pocket. I won't need that long. The afternoon sun filtered through the stained glass windows, painting bands of color across the polished floor. The building felt different now. Not unfamiliar. Watchful. As though every shelf had been waiting for this moment. I reached the history section. A small brass plaque on the end of the aisle read, 19. Hundreds of books stood quietly in front of me. No arrows. No instructions. Just shelves. I almost laughed. Samuel had hidden one clue. Now I was expected to find another among thousands of books. Felt impossible. Then I remembered something. 32 years ago, Samuel never left anything to chance. Every crossword puzzle he designed had a pattern. Every treasure hunt for my students had rules. If he left a clue, he expected me to solve it. I began reading the titles. County records. Railway history. Founding families. Agricultural census. Nothing. Minutes passed. I reached the bottom shelf. A thin green book leaned slightly away from the others. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for me. Pulled it free. The title was familiar. The Founding of Ashcroft. I opened the cover. Nothing. I turned another page. Nothing. Then something slipped onto the floor. A dried maple leaf. Pressed perfectly flat. My breath caught. 33 years earlier, Samuel had placed a maple leaf inside the first book he ever gave me. He called it, A Bookmark Nature Writes Herself. No one else knew that. I carefully unfolded the leaf. Inside it, a tiny strip of paper. Only one sentence. The books remember what people forget. Footsteps echoed behind me. I quickly slipped the paper into my pocket. Thomas appeared at the end of the aisle. Margaret, you've got a visitor. A visitor? He nodded. She says she knew Samuel. Every muscle in my body tightened. Who is she? I've never seen her before. We walked back toward the front desk. An elderly woman stood near the entrance. Elegant gray coat. Walking cane. Silver hair. Calm smile. She looked at me for several seconds before speaking. You must be Margaret Ellis. I am. She extended her hand. My name is Dr. Evelyn Cross. I've been hoping we'd finally meet. Something about that sentence unsettled me. Finally. Not nice to meet you. Not I've heard about you. Finally. She glanced toward the book in my hands. I heard the restoration room found something interesting. I felt my stomach tighten. Who told you that? She smiled politely. In a town this small, news travels quickly. It sounded reasonable, yet something felt wrong. Thomas excused himself to help another visitor. Evelyn stepped closer. I knew Samuel very well. I searched her face. I don't remember him mentioning you. He wouldn't have. We met during his research. Research. The word lingered in my mind. No one had mentioned research. Not Thomas. Not me. Yet she already knew why Samuel had spent so much time in the library. She reached into her handbag and handed me a business card. Ashcroft Historical Society. Director, Dr. Evelyn Cross. If you find anything connected to Samuel, I hope you'll let me see it. I looked into her eyes. She was smiling, but it never reached them. Before I could answer, she gently touched the old history book in my hands. Then she quietly said, "Some stories are meant to stay on the shelf." She turned, walked out of the library, never looking back. I stood there without moving, because for the first time, I wasn't thinking about Samuel. I was thinking about Dr. Evelyn Cross. She had known about the hidden letter before I told anyone. She knew Samuel had been researching the library. And somehow, she seemed more interested in what I might discover than in what had already been found. As I looked down at the green history book again, something caught my eye. Tucked inside the back cover was another checkout card. This one wasn't blank. It contained a complete borrowing history. The final name listed was mine, dated 3 years after Samuel disappeared. I had absolutely no memory of borrowing that book. When I looked closer, my signature wasn't the only thing on the card. Underneath it, in faded blue ink, someone had written 6 words. "You already know where to look." The words refused to leave my mind. You already know where to look. I stared at the faded handwriting until the letters blurred together. "I never borrowed this book," I whispered. Thomas frowned. "The checkout cards are original. I've replaced thousands over the years, but that one has been inside since before I became head librarian. Then someone wrote my name." He gently shook his head. "The ink has aged with the paper." I looked back at the date. October 21st. 3 years after Samuel vanished. I searched my memory. Nothing. No visit. No book. No conversation. It was as though someone had erased that entire week from my life. Thomas carefully slid the card back inside the cover. "You look pale." "I'm fine." It was a lie. For the first time since finding the letter, I wasn't afraid of what Samuel had hidden. I was afraid of what I had forgotten. That evening sleep never came. The rain tapped against my bedroom window while I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. Every date, every clue, every memory I could still trust. Samuel disappeared. The hidden letter. Shelf 19. The maple leaf. The strange checkout card. Then, Dr. Evelyn Cross. One sentence kept echoing. Some stories are meant to stay on the shelf. It wasn't advice. It was a warning. The next morning I arrived at the library before the doors opened. Thomas looked surprised. "I thought you'd need a day. I've already lost 32 years. I don't want to lose another morning." Without another word, he unlocked the front entrance. The library felt completely different when it was empty. No conversations. No footsteps. Only the quiet hum of old lights waking up. Margaret walked straight toward shelf D19. The green history book was gone. She stopped. The space where it had rested for decades was empty. She checked the shelves above. Below. Nearby. Nothing. Thomas noticed her expression. "What happened?" "The book." "What book?" "The green history book." He checked the shelf himself. "It should be here. When did someone borrow it?" He walked to the old circulation computer. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. A few seconds later, his face changed. "It wasn't checked out." "Then where is it?" "I don't know." Neither of them spoke. Thomas searched every return cart, every reading table, every office. Nothing. The book had simply vanished. Margaret slowly looked around the enormous library. For the first time, she wasn't alone with the mystery. Someone else was following the clues. A sharp metallic sound echoed upstairs. Clang. Both of them looked toward the balcony level. "Is someone here already?" Margaret asked. Thomas shook his head. "We don't open for another 20 minutes. The sound came again. Closer this time. Without thinking, Margaret started toward the staircase. Thomas followed. The second floor held the oldest collections in the building. Most visitors never came upstairs. Dust covered the high windows. The air smelled of aging paper and cedar shelves. They reached the top. Silence. Then, A door slowly swung shut at the end of the corridor. Thomas pointed. Maintenance room. They hurried toward it. Margaret pushed the door open. Empty. Only shelves of repair supplies. Boxes. Old lamps. Cleaning carts. One window stood slightly open. The curtain moved gently in the breeze. Whoever had been there was gone. Something caught Margaret's eye. On the workbench lay a single white cotton glove. Library conservators wore those gloves while handling rare books. Thomas picked it up. This isn't ours. He turned it over. Sewn inside the wrist. 2 black letters. A. Margaret's heartbeat quickened. Evelyn Cross. No, Thomas said quietly. That could belong to anyone. It could, Margaret replied. But yesterday she knew about the letter before anyone else should have. Neither of them finished the thought. As they walked back toward the history section, Thomas suddenly stopped. Margaret. He pointed toward the floor. Tiny scraps of green cloth. No bigger than fingernails. Trailing between the shelves. Margaret knelt beside them. She recognized the color immediately. The missing history book. Someone hadn't stolen it carefully. Someone had ripped its cover apart. The trail ended beside an old wooden catalog cabinet that hadn't been used in decades. Every drawer was labeled by hand. Margaret noticed one drawer wasn't fully closed. She pulled it open. Instead of catalog cards, there was an empty space, just large enough to hide a book, or something much more important. Inside the drawer, someone had carved 2 words into the wood years ago. Too late. Margaret stared at them. Fresh sawdust rested beneath the carving. She touched it with one finger. It wasn't years old. It had been carved. Today. Someone wanted her to find that message. The library clock struck 9. The front doors unlocked automatically. Morning visitors began entering downstairs. Ordinary people. Returning books. Reading newspapers. Completely unaware that somewhere inside the building, a race had already begun. Margaret quietly closed the drawer. Then she looked at Thomas. We're not looking for forgotten books anymore. Thomas nodded. We're looking for someone who's one step ahead of us. Margaret slipped Samuel's checkout card back into her coat pocket. For the first time since opening the letter, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not hope. Not grief. Competition. Someone was reading Samuel's trail before she could, and whoever it was, already knew exactly where she would look next. As Margaret reached the library's front doors, a teenage volunteer ran toward her, out of breath. Miss Ellis. I almost forgot. He handed her a small envelope. It was left here this morning. There wasn't any name on the front. Margaret turned it over. There was only one sentence written in blue ink. Stop searching. Before you remember what you did. I didn't open the envelope until I reached my car. The parking lot was almost empty. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while I unfolded the single sheet inside. There were no signatures. No greeting. Only one sentence. Stop searching before you remember what you did. I read it again. And again. What I did. The words settled heavily in my chest. For 32 years, I had blamed myself for not finding Samuel sooner. Now someone wanted me to believe I had done something far worse. I folded the note and slipped it beside Samuel's letter. Fear has a strange way of changing a person. The day before I wanted answers. Now I needed them. The following morning, I arrived before the library opened. Thomas was already waiting outside. You look like you didn't sleep. I didn't. I handed him the anonymous note. He read it twice before looking back at me. This wasn't meant to scare you. It was meant to stop you. Exactly. Which means we're getting close to something. Thomas unlocked the front doors. Before either of us stepped inside, he stopped. I never told you this. What? When the library was renovated in the late 80s, the builders found an old storage room behind the west wall. What happened to it? The board ordered it sealed again. Why? They said it wasn't on any official blueprint. Margaret stared at him. A room that doesn't exist? Thomas nodded slowly. The older staff called it the memory room. The basement smelled of dust and old stone. Bare light bulbs cast long shadows across the narrow corridor. Thomas carried an old ring of brass keys. I've never opened this door. You have the key. I have every key. But no one ever gave permission. After several attempts, one rusted lock finally turned. The heavy wooden door groaned open. Cold air drifted into the hallway. Neither of them spoke. The room was untouched. Shelves lined every wall. Wooden filing cabinets stood beneath faded portraits. A large reading table sat in the center beneath a thick layer of dust. It looked less like a storage room, more like someone had simply walked away one afternoon and never returned. Margaret moved slowly through the room. Everything was covered, except one chair. Its dust had been disturbed recently. Someone had been sitting there. Thomas noticed it too. We're not the first people to come down here. Margaret nodded. They're still searching. At the far end of the room stood a narrow cabinet with dozens of small drawers. Each drawer held handwritten catalog cards. Thomas smiled faintly. This is how libraries worked before computers. Margaret gently opened one drawer. Empty. Another. Empty. A third. Inside lay a single black and white photograph. She picked it up carefully. The picture showed the library entrance almost 40 years earlier. Children stood on the steps. Parents smiled toward the camera. Volunteers held boxes of donated books. Margaret recognized several faces immediately. Teachers. Neighbors. The former mayor. Then her breathing stopped. Near the back of the crowd stood Samuel. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at someone else. Margaret followed his line of sight. Standing beside the library doors was a young woman wearing a volunteer badge. Dr. Evelyn Cross. She looked almost 30 years younger. But there was no mistaking her face. Thomas leaned closer. So they knew each other. No. Margaret shook her head. They knew each other much better than she admitted. A soft sound echoed from somewhere above them. Footsteps. Not one person. Two. They froze. The footsteps crossed the main floor, then stopped directly above the hidden room. Thomas whispered, "The library isn't open yet." Another sound followed. A heavy object scraped across the wooden floor. Someone was moving furniture. Margaret looked toward the ceiling. They know we're down here. The footsteps remained still. No voices. No movement. Only silence. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps moved away. Thomas exhaled slowly. I don't think that was a coincidence. Neither do I. Margaret continued searching. Near the reading table she noticed something scratched into the wood. The marks were almost invisible beneath the dust. She brushed the surface gently with her hand. Letters appeared. Not carved. Written in pencil. Samuel's handwriting. Only 4 words. Don't trust the catalog. Thomas frowned. The catalog? Margaret looked around the room. Every wall contained index drawers. Thousands of handwritten records. If the catalog couldn't be trusted, neither could the location of any book. Samuel hadn't been hiding clues in random places. He had been hiding them inside a filing system someone else had already changed. The entire library had become a puzzle. Thomas suddenly reached into one of the drawers. His expression changed. Margaret, what is it? He held up an old borrowing ledger. One page had been torn out. Not decades ago. Recently. The missing page covered only 1 week. October 14th through October 21st. The exact week Samuel disappeared. Someone had returned. Someone had removed the only records that still existed. Margaret looked toward the open doorway. Whoever was following them hadn't just stayed one step ahead. They had been cleaning up the evidence as they went. As Margaret carefully closed the old ledger, a small metal key slipped from between its pages and landed on the floor. A faded paper tag was tied to it. Only 3 words were written in Samuel's handwriting. Reading room 7. The brass key felt heavier than it should have. Margaret turned it over in her hand. The faded paper tag still read, Reading Room 7. Thomas stared at it. I've worked here for 40 years. We only have 4 public reading rooms. Margaret looked at him. So where is number 7? Thomas didn't answer. Because he didn't know. Back upstairs, the library slowly filled with morning visitors. Children gathered near the picture books. College students searched for study tables. An elderly man quietly unfolded his newspaper by the front window. The building looked perfectly ordinary again. Only Margaret knew how much had changed beneath its floors. Thomas disappeared into his office. 20 minutes later, he returned carrying a thick leather binder. He placed it on the circulation desk. I found the original construction plans. Margaret opened the brittle pages. The first blueprint matched the library exactly. The second showed an earlier design. She counted the rooms. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Her eyes stopped. Reading Room 7 wasn't inside the main building. It had been built as a small research annex connected by a covered walkway. A handwritten note crossed out the entire structure. Demolished October 1989. October. The same month Samuel disappeared. Margaret slowly closed the binder. What was built there instead? Thomas looked toward the front windows. A parking lot. An hour later, Margaret stood alone across the street. Cars now covered the place where Reading Room 7 had once stood. Nothing remained. Or so it seemed. She studied the cracked pavement. One corner had sunk slightly lower than the rest, as though something still existed underneath. Before she could look closer, her phone rang. The screen showed an unknown number. She answered cautiously. Hello. For several seconds, no one spoke. Only quiet breathing. Then a man's voice. Older. Calm. You should have listened. The call ended. Margaret stood frozen. The number disappeared before she could write it down. That evening, she drove home along Willow Lane. Halfway there, she noticed headlights behind her. The same dark sedan had followed her since leaving the library. She turned left. The sedan turned left. She turned right. So did the sedan. Her heartbeat quickened. Without thinking, she pulled into a crowded grocery store parking lot. The sedan continued past her without slowing down. Maybe it had never been following her. Maybe. But doubt had already settled into her mind. Inside her house, Margaret placed every clue across the dining table. Samuel's letter. The checkout card. The maple leaf. The anonymous warning. The photograph. The brass key. She stared at them for nearly an hour. Nothing connected. Until she noticed the maple leaf. Its stem pointed toward the lower corner of the paper. Almost deliberately, she lifted it. Something was tucked beneath it. A second strip of paper. So small she hadn't noticed it before. She unfolded it carefully. There was an address. 18 Willow Lane. Her own breath caught. That wasn't a random house. It had been Samuel's home. The next morning, Margaret parked outside the abandoned property. Nature had reclaimed most of the yard. Tall weeds covered the front steps. The mailbox leaned sideways. Every window was coated with dust. A faded notice from the county still hung beside the door. Condemned. No one had lived there in decades. She tried the front door. Locked. She walked around the side of the house. One basement window had been broken long ago. Carefully she climbed inside. The air smelled of damp wood and old memories. Furniture still stood where it had been left. Books lined the walls. A coffee mug rested on the desk. It looked as though someone had planned to return the next day, but never did. Margaret slowly walked into the study. She recognized the room immediately. This was where Samuel had written every article. She touched the old wooden desk, then stopped. A fresh footprint marked the dusty floor. Someone else had been there. Recently. Very recently. Margaret followed the prints. They ended beside a narrow bookshelf. One shelf sat slightly crooked. She pressed against it. Nothing happened. She tried again. A dull click echoed inside the wall. The bookshelf moved just enough to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside rested a small metal box. Its lock was already broken. Someone had opened it before she arrived. The box was empty, except for one cassette tape. Across the label, written in Samuel's familiar handwriting, were 5 words. For Margaret. 5 fail. Margaret reached for the tape, then stopped. A floorboard creaked behind her. She wasn't alone. Slowly, she turned around. A man stood silently in the doorway. Late 60s. Gray jacket. Hands in his pockets. His face showed no anger, only disappointment. He looked directly at Margaret and quietly said, "You've opened the wrong story." Before Margaret could answer, the stranger took one step closer. Then he spoke the one sentence she never expected to hear. "Samuel knew you would come, because I told him you would." The stranger stood silently in the doorway. Neither of them moved. Dust drifted through the broken window behind him. Margaret kept one hand on the cassette tape. "You know Samuel?" The man nodded once. "I did. Who are you?" "My name is Arthur Bennett." The name meant nothing to her. "I worked in this town for 40 years. He looked around the abandoned study. "I was the library's archivist." Margaret frowned. "Thomas never mentioned you." "He wouldn't. I retired before he became head librarian." Arthur stepped closer. His eyes settled on the metal box. "So, you finally found it." Margaret's voice hardened. "You knew this was here." "I helped Samuel build it." Silence filled the room. For more than 3 decades, this man had carried a piece of the truth. "You sent the warning." Arthur slowly nodded. "I hoped you'd stop." "Why?" "Because once you know everything, you lose the life you've spent 32 years trying to rebuild." Margaret looked directly at him. "I never rebuilt it." For the first time, Arthur looked genuinely saddened. "I was afraid you'd say that." Margaret held up the cassette tape. "What is this?" Arthur answered quietly. "The reason Samuel disappeared." They returned to the library together. Thomas locked the front doors after closing. The 3 of them sat inside the hidden memory room. An old cassette player still rested on one of the shelves. Thomas carefully inserted the tape. A click echoed through the room. Static. Then Samuel's voice, older than Margaret remembered. "Calm. Steady. If you're hearing this, it means I was right. Someone eventually made a mistake." Margaret closed her eyes. She hadn't heard his voice in 32 years. Not once. Samuel continued. "Margaret, if you're listening, I need you to forgive yourself. None of this happened because of you. It happened because I asked too many questions. I wasn't investigating a murder or missing money. I was investigating a lie. Not a lie written in newspapers. A lie people chose to believe because it was easier than the truth. I discovered documents proving that the town's celebrated founder never built Ashcroft alone. The real architect of this town was a woman. Her name was Eleanor Ashcroft. Every original record carrying her name was quietly removed over decades. Not because people hated her, because powerful men believed no town would respect a woman as its founder. So they erased her. Piece by piece. History didn't forget Eleanor. People did. Margaret looked toward Arthur. He slowly lowered his head. Samuel's voice continued. "When I found the proof, I knew it would disappear. So I hid every document where no politician, no official, and no thief would think to search. Inside the books you loved most. Because I trusted one person more than anyone else. You." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Samuel gave a small laugh. "You probably think I was brave. I wasn't. I was terrified. Terrified they'd destroy the truth. Terrified they'd come after you. So I did the only thing I could. I disappeared before they reached you." Arthur quietly whispered. "He wasn't running away. He was protecting you." Samuel's recording continued. "If you've reached this point, one thing still remains. Open the last book. The one you never returned." Thomas looked confused. "The last book?" Margaret stood motionless. Her breathing slowed. I know where it is. Neither man spoke. She walked out of the memory room, past the silent shelves, past the reading tables, into the English literature section, third shelf from the top, exactly where she had left it 32 years earlier. A worn copy of Jane Eyre. She pulled it free. No library stamp. No checkout slip. It had never been returned because she had never returned it. She opened the cover. Inside rested a folded sheet of paper. Not another clue. Not another warning. A marriage license. Issued to Samuel Brooks and Margaret Ellis. And signed. Never filed. Never used. Behind it rested a pressed maple leaf. The very first one he had ever given her. Margaret smiled through tears. Not because she had solved the mystery. Because she finally understood it. Samuel hadn't spent 32 years asking her to find him. He had spent 32 years making sure the truth survived. The library had never been hiding secrets. It had been keeping a promise. 6 months later, Ashcroft officially recognized Eleanor Ashcroft as the town's true founder. The statue in the square was replaced. History books were corrected. The hidden archives became a permanent public exhibit inside the Carnegie Library. One display remained untouched. An old hardcover novel, a faded envelope, a pressed maple leaf, and beside them, a small brass plaque. Some stories aren't found. They're patiently waiting for the right reader. Every Tuesday morning, Margaret still walked to the library. She always stopped at the same shelf. She always smiled at the same old books. Because she finally understood something she had spent most of her life teaching. The truth doesn't disappear. Sometimes, it simply waits for someone who refuses to stop turning the page.